I'm Christine McNeil with the Cabinet for Economic Development and KY Innovation, and welcome to our webinar on budget translating science to dollars. Eva Garland with Eva Garland Consultants will be presenting today, so I will let her take it away.
Great, thank you, Christine, and look forward to chatting today about constructing your budget, given that the main point of getting your SBIR proposal is so that you can have funds that are going to be appropriately allocated to be able to do your science. Putting together a budget at time of submission is probably equally important to putting together your scientific plan. And so what I'll do today is to talk about the basics of how to create a budget and what are some of the key considerations to make sure that once you get the award that there's no surprises, that you're getting the money in a way that you're going to be able to maximize its utility for completing the project that you proposed. I, of course, want to thank Christine for setting this up today, as well as KY Innovation and through the FAST Partnership Program through the Small Business Administration. Also, if you have any questions as this goes along, feel free to send them via the comments, and Christine will interrupt me, which is great, and make sure that I can answer all your questions. Okay, so agenda today is first of all knowing the lingo, maximizing your award, coordinating subawards and subcontracts, which are critical parts of many SBIR, STTR awards if you aren't doing all of the work at the company, but you're utilizing other subcontractors, vendors, working with universities, and finally preparing your budget justification. Okay. So when you create a budget, there's going to be three main categories. The first are direct costs. Direct costs are essentially a line item of the expenses that are going to be required in order to complete the work that you've proposed. Indirect costs are also included as part of a budget for SBIR, STTR proposals, which is nice because what that is on top of the costs that are actually needed to complete the work. The government recognizes that the company has other indirect expenditures, things like your accounting, your legal costs, your management costs, administrative costs, facilities rentals. So these are costs that are not directly line itemed in your budget for completing your grant award, but they're important for running your company, essentially your G&A, your general and administrative expenses. And in general, you can request approximately 40% of your direct costs as indirect costs. So that's quite a bit of funding you can get on top of the direct costs for completing the project. In addition, something that's really unusual about the SBIR STTR program that's not true for other types of government grants. So if you're used to academic grants, you would only see directs and indirects. But for SBIR STTR, since the program is looking to support commercialization, they actually provide you with a profit. 7% of your directs and indirects you can request in what's called the fee. The fee is just a kicker. It's on top of everything else. You can use that money for anything. You don't have to give any sort of explanation. And that's really nice because that helps to cover any costs that you can't fund with your directs or your indirects. So how do you construct a budget? Okay, so what does this really look like? So let's say that you're putting together a proposal, you've got $150,000 in direct costs. Now you can take about 40% of that as indirects, and then 7% of the directs plus indirects as your fee to get to your $225K total budget, which is typical for many agencies for the Phase 1 award. So as you're constructing your budget, it often makes sense to really work backwards to start with, okay, what is that total allowable budget for the agency? Maximize your fee because your fee can be spent on anything. Maximize your indirects because that's important for running your company. And then see what's left and see if you can construct your research budget within that restriction of the total direct costs that remain. Okay, so with the direct costs, you need to further break them down into direct costs that are going to be going internally to your company, and those can include things like your personnel salaries, materials and supplies, anything that's a fee for service. So essentially you're buying a chemical from Aldrich, or you're having a company manufacture a part for your product, for your prototype. All of these are considered internal costs. Equipment's an internal cost. Lab space rental is kind of an interesting thing. You can include that as an internal cost for a direct cost. Some companies consider lab space rental to be indirect. If you're using the lab for more than just this one project, it's going to be easier to call that a G&A indirect expense. But you are allowed to consider lab space rental an internal direct cost as well, just whatever is more appropriate for your specific company. Travel would be internal. External costs are still direct costs, so it's still money required to complete the R&D for your project, but they aren't going to be used directly by your company. They're going to be essentially, think about your company as being sort of a flow through for where these external costs might go. So these go to third parties who are going to have intellectual input in the project. Anytime you have a subaward with an academic collaborator, or if you are going to be working with a contract research organization who's going to be, say, developing a synthesis for you, or actually adding intellectual input into that final product, that's considered an external expense. And it's important to keep in mind when you're constructing your budget, what expenses are internal on your direct costs and what expenses are external, because there's going to be certain rules about allowability and percentages of the total budget that needs to go internal versus external. Okay. So examples of external costs, as I mentioned, a subaward, say, to a university, or a subcontract to another company that is adding intellectual input to the project. Consultants are also considered external costs, and so employees are internal, consultants are external, so it's good to keep that in mind. Okay, so for SBIRs, you need to spend a total of 67% of your budget with internal costs. So of the total budget, 67% needs to go internal. So you can't have your company essentially flow through 50, 60, 70% of the budget to a university. And so again, that's important to keep in mind. And that's actually where an STTR is nice, because the rules are a little bit different there. And that's for phase one. In your phase two project, you can have up to 50% of the budget external. So phase one, SBIR, 67% needs to be internal. Phase two, 50% needs to be internal. Now, an STTR requires that you have at least 40% of the budget directed to your company as an internal cost. A minimum of 30% needs to go to that partnering research institute, which is often that university. And those numbers are the same for both phase one and phase two. Another thing to keep in mind in terms of the logistics of constructing your budget, so that you know these up front, you can get the costs into the right categories, is that the SBIR requires that the principal investigator is at least 51% employed by the company submitting the proposal. That doesn't mean that you need to have 6 months salary going to the PI. You can have the principal investigator only receive a small fraction of their total salary from the award. So you can have them paid, say, 1 or 2 months off the grant, but they do need to have 51% employment by the company during the time frame of the grant performance period. The STTR is more flexible. The principal investigator needs to be 51% employed by either the company or the partnering research institute. And so if you've got a university investigator who's going to be essentially leading the project, an STTR can be a way that that individual can be a principal investigator. Okay, so the kind of overview of the terms and the restrictions. Now you're ready to kind of put that budget together. So you've read the solicitation, make sure you read it very, very carefully. Each agency has its own budget rules. There's a lot of nuances. So make sure you are reading that fine print. One trick that I often recommend, if you have an agency where you're reading the fine print and it just feels a little bit nebulous to you, so it says, well, the cap on this is $225K, but in certain situations you can go over. It's a really good idea to take a look at the budgets of awarded proposals, and that information is available. You can go to SBIR.gov and look at awarded proposals and look at the actual budgets by agency and get a sense for that specific agency. Is it pretty typical that companies are going over the standard budget, or is it unusual? And a really good example is NIH, where NIH, the standard limit is $150K for their phase one, but the average budget for a phase one NIH grant is much more than that. It's roughly 225 to 250K. So that's an example of an agency that routinely awards budgets that are higher than the standard. And so it's good to know that going in, because you're leaving money on the table if you're only requesting the 150 when the vast majority of phase one grants are receiving more. And again, just kind of using NIH as an example, each institute is quite different. So NINDS, which is within NIH, can award up to 700K for a phase one. NCI, the National Cancer Institute, they can award up to 400K. So make sure you've read the fine print and also looked at awarded proposals to get a sense for what types of budgets are typically awarded for that specific agency. Now, other agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, they don't have nearly as much money, and so their budgets are hard capped. And so when they say 100K, that's the hard cap. They're not going to be able to give any more than that. So good idea to look at the actual budgets and to talk to the program officer as well about your budget, and make sure that A, your budget is fitting your scope of work, and that B, it's on par with what the agency would typically award. Other things that you see that are a little bit different from agency to agency, the regulations around indirects. I had mentioned earlier that in general, you can expect that you're going to be able to request about 40% of your directs and indirects. But each agency is going to have some additional rules around that. The National Science Foundation, for example, only allows you to use your salaries and wages as the base. So you can't take 40% of your entire direct costs. You have to take your indirects just based on your salaries and wages. But they do allow you to go up to 50% on indirects, but that's based on the salaries and wages, not on your total direct costs. Department of Defense is known for asking you to justify why do you need this amount of indirects. So you have to be sort of prepared to justify that at time of award. So every agency is a little bit different there. NIH is probably the most straightforward. They allow you to request 40% of your direct costs with no justification. NSF, as I mentioned, 50% of salaries and wages. DoD requires justification at time of award, and each other agency has its own nuances as well. So there's 12 different agencies. Each of them are a little bit different in terms of the details of what you can request. Another nuance is NSF doesn't allow equipment purchases for phase one. So, that's in the fine print if you read it. So make sure that you've done that, because then if you put equipment into your budget, they might disallow it, which then reduces your overall budget. Okay, so that's a very brief overview of the lingo. And of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to be putting those into comments. I'm happy to address them. But now that we've got kind of that high level background, let's talk specifically about something that I find, is really important that you do up front, which is maximizing your award. And by maximizing, it's not necessarily trying to get every last dollar. What it's about is how can we make sure that this award is really supporting the science that we need to do in the best way possible. And this is really important to do up front when you're preparing your budget, because once you receive that award, it's really hard to make adjustments. So it's important to do things right up front. Okay, the first thing is to understand what the budgets are for each different agency. And you can see here there's quite a range in terms of what is typically allowable for the different agencies. This can help even as you go take a step back to your overall strategy. So if I've got a technology and it can be applicable, say, to USDA as well as to Department of Defense, and I see that USDA has a cap of 100K for phase one, 600K for phase two, but DoD, the caps are higher, 150 and 1 million. That might help me to determine that, hey, maybe I want to further prioritize the DoD because that's the type of money that you need to get to development. On the other hand, if you've got a product that really only requires, you know, 600-700K to get to market, then USDA would, you know, be a great fit. So kind of keeping in mind in your overall strategy what the budget availabilities are by agency. So once you've determined which solicitation you're applying for and it's ready to try to put that budget together, how do you develop that budget? And it's a fairly complicated thing. There's lots of bits and pieces. There's, you know, all these different categories, and, you know, how much do I spend on people? How much do I spend on materials? What I recommend and what we recommend overall, you know, when we're working with clients on putting together a budget for a proposal, first of all, create a budget as early as possible in the process, at least a rough draft. You can put in placeholders, but make sure that the budget is, you know, going to be aligned with the budget restrictions. And so what we'll see sometimes is a client will put together a beautiful scope of work, a wonderful proposal, and then when we budget it all out, you know, it's 800-900K, which is well beyond what a phase one, you know, can achieve. And so, you know, now you're going back in and you're trying to figure out what to cut. It's much easier up front to at least have a big picture idea of what that budget's going to look like. And you can do this by creating a spreadsheet. We usually use Excel spreadsheets that list line by line the different cost categories, and then you can, you know, pretty simply program the sheet to make sure that you get the subtotal for all internal expenses, the subtotal for all external expenses. That gives you, you know, the chance to make sure that you're within all those guidelines. And in just a minute, I'll show you an example of what an Excel sheet might look like. It's really good idea when you're creating the sheet to just copy from the agency application the different cost categories. So you don't need to kind of reinvent the wheel on what are the different cost categories. The agency in the application that you're going to submit is going to have line item all the cost categories. So I would copy these directly. Each agency, they're, you know, a little bit different in terms of what the categories are. So whatever you're applying for, go ahead and put those into your Excel sheet. As I mentioned, start this early on. If there's certain categories you don't know yet, so, you know, you need to manufacture a part and you think it's going to be somewhere between 50 and 100K, just put in a filler. You know, maybe you can put in a couple scenarios, you know, starting early with at least a rough idea can be very helpful. One thing that's important in terms of starting early is, and this is true in general when preparing grant applications, anything that's going to rely on people outside of your company is going to be somewhat outside of your control. And as you know, grants have really hard deadlines, whereas sometimes it can be hard to get information from universities and other entities. People go on vacation, things happen. So make sure that as soon as you know you're going to be partnering, whether it be through a subaward or a subcontract, to get in contact with their business office, not just the principal investigator, but make sure that you have that direct link with the business office. For universities, it's called the pre-award office. That's who you want to get in contact with. And what I would do is make sure, you know, write the administrator, say, you know, this is the date that the grant is due, this is the solicitation number, and, you know, what do you need from me in order to provide me with a budget? And so you can kind of start that communication early and then get some dates in there. So if it's grants due September 5th, you know, letting the pre-award office know that you need everything, say by August 20th or whatever that date is, so that you have time to integrate it within the overall proposal. For any CROs, request the quotes early on for the same reason that, you know, it can take a while to get these quotes. Also, we've had situations where a quote comes back and it's not really not in line with what the client was expecting. So you're expecting something's going to cost 20K, you find out it's 80K. Well, that's going to change your entire scope of work. And so getting that information as early as possible is very helpful. So here's what a sample budget spreadsheet might look like. I used NIH as an example, but, you know, it'd be similar for any other agency. And for most agencies, they'll start by having you budget out the cost for personnel. And there'll be key personnel who are, you know, the sort of key individuals, and making sure that the project is successful. So you have your lead engineer, or your biologist, whatever that might be, your CSO. And so you would list them out here. I find it easier to, instead of just trying to put a flat number for them, I like to put in their annual salary and their effort. The reason for that is, as you're kind of playing with and tweaking the budget, you can play with that effort number to try to make the budget fit. So, that's kind of one of those, that column E there is something that you can play with as you're getting toward the end of your budget, to try to, get everything to that final total that you're trying to achieve. Same idea with other personnel, equipment, as you can see, and then travel. Got materials and supplies, consultants, and subawards and subcontracts. And you see how they've been labeled external costs. So you want to keep that in mind. And then other could be your lab rental, fee for service, or other expenses that are not captured above. So the way that this spreadsheet would work is, then you would total up your direct costs, your directs that are for the small business. So that's your internal expenses, to make sure that that is the appropriate percentage of your total costs. Your indirect cost base. So what that is for many agencies, that's going to be your direct costs. But as I mentioned, for NSF, that's just going to be your salaries and wages. So whatever it is that you are allowed to include as the base from which you calculate your percent of indirects. And then your fee, your 7%, and then you get your total at the bottom. Okay. So one thing we see a lot are companies, especially your phase 1 SBIR, one of the biggest challenges is trying to get to that 67% of internal costs, because a lot of small businesses, you don't have necessarily your own lab space yet, and a lot of the work you need to do does need to be outsourced. So a tip, a lot of companies can use help in terms of tips for maximizing how to get their internal costs for an SBIR up to that 66% for phase 1, or 67% for phase 1, and then up to 40% for your phase 2. So one thing is, make sure you're requesting all of your allowable fees and indirects. These are considered internal costs. So when you do your calculation for what percent of total costs are internal, you get all your fees and all your indirects get to go into the bucket of being internal costs. So maximizing those can help. Personnel salaries are a good way to increase your internal costs. A lot of times we work with entrepreneurs who are saying, well, I'm not going to pay myself right now. I want to use the money for other things at the company. But sometimes that can be challenging when you're creating a grant budget for several reasons. One is, that can then make it hard to get enough internal costs. 2 is that when the reviewers are taking a look at the budget, and they, you might write, hey, I'm an entrepreneur, I don't want to pay myself yet. And you look at that as a real positive thing, that you're really committed and dedicating and get dedicated to, the company and putting your own skin in the game. Reviewers, I've seen a lot, actually will come back and say, oh, well, if that person isn't getting paid, how do I know they're really committed? So it's kind of a funny thing that we've seen. And so we actually do recommend that pay yourself with the grant budget. You don't have to pay yourself until you get your grant, but once you get that grant, it is generally a good idea to be giving, yourself, if you're the PI or any other key personnel, go ahead and pay them the appropriate amount as much as possible within the overall budget. Computer purchases, if you're looking for internal expenses, certain agencies have certain restrictions on what you can buy, so pay attention to the fine print, but that's one way to increase your internal costs. Also, as I mentioned, lab space, you have the option of putting lab space as an internal cost, or sorry, as a direct cost, or just include that as your indirects. As you get more mature as a company, if you've got several grants that you're holding, it's going to be much easier to put lab space into an indirect, because it's supporting all the different projects and it's too hard to kind of segregate by grant. However, especially if you're applying for your first SBIR, if you can kind of segregate, hey, I'm going to use this lab space just for this experiment, just for the experiments that support this grant, then you can include that as a direct cost, and that can be helpful in order to get more internal costs. Okay, so now I want to move to one of the more challenging areas of creating your budget, which is coordinating with subawardees and subcontractors, and what are some of the things you need to keep in mind here. Okay, so first of all, what is a subaward? A subaward is, you can think of that as essentially funds that are going to pass through your company to a third party. And for a subaward, that third party is going to provide an entire budget on their own. And so they're going to have their own directs, their own indirects. And typically when we're looking at subawards, we're looking at universities or other nonprofit research institutes. And so their offices are very used to creating budgets, and their indirects are going to be very different from how you calculate your indirects because they've got negotiated rates with the government. And so they're going to have, you know, kind of their own approach that in some ways feels more complicated because they're going to have percentages for their fringe and things that you aren't really going to consider yet as a early stage company. But on the other hand, they're a fairly well-oiled machine. And so usually when you get the budget from your subawardee, it's going to be constructed in a way that you don't have to, you know, do too much to scrutinize it. They've done this a lot. However, it's very important to be communicating with the right person, and the individual who, you know, has worked on SBIR, STTRs before can be, you know, very helpful. So they will need to fill out both the subaward budget, and they're also going to have their own budget justification. And this will all come from the university or nonprofit that you're working with. Now for a subcontract, that's typically going to be arranged with a contract research organization. Now the CRO does not have to give you a full budget with directs and indirects. It can be just a standard quote, a flat fee quote, which is, you know, what they're used to providing for clients, and that's perfectly fine. You do want to make sure that there is a kind of a firm number there. Make sure that it's not, hey, this is going to be, you know, $100 an hour for somewhere between 10 and 1,000 hours. I think that's, you really want to try to avoid that in terms of kind of constructing your grant budget. As firm as you can get is very, very helpful. So when talking to that subcontractor, explaining that, you know, you understand that yes, the scope can change and they can have all sorts of, you know, fine print there, but as much as possible, you know, give you a single number so that you can take that single number, you know, $24,000, whatever it is, and put it directly into your grant budget. When you create your budget justification, make sure you include the quotation that the subcontractor has provided to provide evidence of where that number is coming from. Depending on the agency, you may be putting that quote in the budget justification. You might be including it in letters of support. Either way is fine, but just make sure that that quotation gets in to your grant proposal. Okay, and a reminder that both subawards and subcontracts are external costs. The subcontract is where it gets tricky because if the subcontractor is providing intellectual input, so they are designing, developing, and building something for you, that's definitely external. However, if you've got a, you know, what on the surface might feel like a subcontract, so you've got, you know, someone, you know, making 10 pounds of you know, some material for you, as long as it's something that, you know, pretty much any vendor could, you know, in the field could do, you can call that a fee for service and keep that internal. So there's definitely a gray area and a fine line between what the agencies will consider a subcontract, where the vendor is providing intellectual input, and what they would consider a fee for service. And so if you're kind of on that fine line, it's a good idea to talk to the granting agency up front to make sure that, you know, you're clear in terms of whether they'll accept a certain service as being a fee for service versus a subcontract. Okay, so some tricks in working with your subawards and your subcontracts. It can take universities typically about 3 to 4 weeks to develop their subaward budget. They do have multiple levels of approval. we've definitely run into situations a lot where somewhere along those levels of approval, somebody's out of town or unavailable. So, make sure that you ask them up front how long they're going to need to construct the budget. Ask them what they're going to need from you. You just want to make sure you're on the same page in communication, because a lot of universities are going to need to see the proposal before they can start to put together the budget for it. And so, it's kind of a chicken and egg, and you're waiting for the budget to finish the proposal and vice versa. So make sure that you're communicating with them and, getting them the information that they need in order to be able to provide you with the paperwork that you need. Being aware of the indirect costs up front is important. So I think it's a good idea to know for the university that you're working with, what their indirects are going to be. Because remember, a lot of times when you're working with the principal investigator, they're just looking at, okay, well, what is the cost I need to do the science? So I need a graduate student for 6 months, I need these materials. And so they kind of think, okay, I can do all that for $80K. And so that's the estimate that you get from the principal investigator. But then when the university tacks on the indirect, now that $80K has become $120K, and all of a sudden it's messed up your whole budget. So be really careful in terms of the communication you have, and try to keep that communication as much through the pre-award office as possible, because they're going to have the expertise to really understand all the nuances, whereas the principal investigator is just really looking at the direct costs to run their lab. Also, it's good to keep in mind that for grant awards that are not SBIR, STTR, so awards like R01s, DoD contracts, etc., generally when the investigators put together the budget, they're really only thinking about their directs, and the caps on the budgets are all based on direct costs. So you might have an R01 that has a cap of $500K a year. That's just the directs. And so the principal investigator never has to worry about indirects. And so this is really kind of the first time that they're going to be in a situation where they're applying for a grant where indirects are included in the cap on the total budget. So it's a very different way of thinking from what many academics are used to in constructing their budgets. In addition to including the subawardee paperwork, always include biosketches for the key personnel. This is really going to help to show that you have this additional expertise contributing to the grant. And I also think it's a good idea to include a letter of support. So, not just having the budget there, but actually have the subawardee PI indicate that they're committed to the project. And then and I'll mention this in a minute, but for STTRs, you're also going to need a letter from the university as well, agreeing to be your partner in research institute. And so, including all of that can really help to kind of further show the commitment of the subawardee to be a true partner in the project. All right, so once you've got your budget pulled together, you've got all your quotes in, you've got your subawards, your subcontracts, now you've got to put together your budget justification. So from the perspective of a reviewer, they might glance really quickly at all the numbers that you've got in the chart that I showed earlier that you created through the Excel spreadsheet. And then they're going to want to understand, well, why do you need this money? What's the purpose? And this actually, the budget justification, I think, is a section that you can really utilize to your advantage, because it's a section where you can help to further explain to the reviewer the expertise that you have to complete the project, and that you've really thought through all the details of how you're going to pull this together. Okay. Purpose of the budget justification is to justify the scientific need for all your direct costs. So how I like to start is I like to take a look at the research plan and just go through it kind of step by step, each aim that you've proposed, and kind of write out a list of what is going to be needed to complete that. So if I'm running an assay and it's going to take 3 months and it's going to need to be analyzed with mass spec, I kind of just write all that down. And then you get everything priced. And so you say, okay, well, for this project, I'm going to need 3 months of this person, of this person's effort. I'm going to need, these specific materials. I'm going to need fee for service for the mass spec. I'm going to use the local university's lab, whatever that looks like, and just write it all out. Things that are heavily scrutinized, personnel time commitments. And so if you've got a project where you're saying, okay, we're gonna have 1 month of biological assays being run, and the rest of it is, you know, really an engineering project, and you put in a biologist for 6 months, that's going to be really looked on unfavorably by the reviewers. The reviewers want to make sure that you've justified why that personnel is needed for that entire time that you have them down for. Again, this is a little different from academic grants, where you'll often see academics just say, oh, I need, you know, to fund my grad student for 3 years, but that's not going to work for an SBIR. You really need to kind of look at the experiment and say, okay, we're going to be, you know, using a certain expertise for 2 months, and therefore this individual, I can only put 2 months of that individual's time into the budget. The other thing that we see really heavily scrutinized is travel. Generally, for SBIR STTRs, you can sometimes get away with putting in conferences in terms of your travel budget, but generally the reviewers would much rather see you put the money toward doing the actual science and, you know, moving that science along toward commercialization, rather than you know, just broadening your expertise in the field. They see that as more of an academic pursuit. So when you do have travel, I would typically use it for instances where you need to you know, meet and discuss the project progress. So if you've got a subawardee or a contractor who's out of town and you need to travel to discuss the project with that individual, that's usually the best way to utilize the travel budget. I will mention that some agencies do have kind of specific, again, regulations. For example, NSF requires you to put in a travel budget to go to their annual conference, so pay attention to those things. I think it's a really good idea to try to line item your direct costs. It shows that you've really thought through what you're going to need. And so, yes, you know, you may need, you know, say $5K for glassware and pipettes and, you know, just general supplies, and that's okay, but if you can get a little more detail, that would be helpful. So let's say that, you know, $500 of that is just really just kind of general lab supplies, that's fine. But then, you know, maybe, you know, you need a couple of, you know, more expensive, you know, custom glass blown items. And I would go ahead and line item those, and if possible, put quotes in, really showing that you've really thought through everything that's going to be needed. Understanding that can change. So at time of award, it's no problem to change things as the science moves in a different direction. That's okay. But getting your best guess at time of application helps to show, you know, I think helps to strengthen your application that you've really thought that through. You do not need to justify at time of application your indirects and fee. Some agencies might ask you to justify at time of award for specific mechanisms, but you can just sort of put down the allowable amounts for your indirects and fee. And one thing that I haven't mentioned, but you know, as you get more mature as a company, you may at some point be negotiating your indirect rate with the government. Typically, we won't see that until a company has multiple phase 2 awards. So down the line, there may be some of you on the seminar today who are more advanced in your SBIR, STTR, and grants. In that case, if you have a negotiated rate with the government, of course, you can put that in instead of the you know, standard rate that the agency allows. Remember that your subaward needs their separate budget as well as their separate budget justification. That's something I see companies just forget and omit from time to time. So make sure you have remembered to include that. And as I've said, there's a lot of agency-specific requirements. Some agencies want to know every last piece of every last material that you're purchasing, you know, down to, you know, 500 pipettes at 4 cents each, and others are okay with a higher level. I would be as detailed as possible at time of application, recognizing that at time of award you may be asked for more detail. Travel justifications is very important, and then also that the budget makes sense for the travel you're requesting. So you know, it's probably a good idea to take a look at actual, you know, what are going to be roughly the airfare costs, what's the rough per diem for the city you're traveling to for hotels and you know, food and meals and other expenses. So just to make sure that, you know, if you've got a one-day trip from New Jersey to New York, it's not $5,000. So make sure that you're reasonable there. Okay. So kind of going through section by section, this is trying to give you a roadmap of how you can create that budget justification and what should be included in each section. For key personnel, make sure that you do line item each individual senior key person, include their names, include their expertise. And you've got a couple sentences now to remind the reviewers of why they're so important to completing the project and how they're going to help your project succeed. So take advantage of that to sort of restate the key personnel's contribution to the project. And then after stating what their contribution is going to be, then that helps to justify the level of effort that you're going to be putting into the justification. Typically, what you're going to see for SBIR STTRs is the effort is going to be in terms of calendar months. For academics, you sometimes see summer months. So if you see that in your sub-award, that's fine. You don't need to do that as a company. As a company, I would typically just use calendar months of effort. I'd say most often we don't see fringe included for early stage companies as a direct cost because it's hard to calculate and accurately estimate, and you'll often be asked to justify it at time of award. Some companies do like to put it in. It's okay if you do, just make sure you can justify what that fringe is going to be used for. A lot of times, you know, your total cap isn't going to change anyway. We see companies just include fringe and as part of their indirects. Either way is okay, but you just make sure if you put in a fringe rate, don't put anything, you know, nearly as high as what you'll see at the universities. It's going to be very hard to justify, say, a 30% fringe. But if you wanted to put in a 10% fringe, and if you can justify that, you know, based on your actual expenditures, then that's fine. Every agency is going to have their own salary cap regulations, so make sure you pay attention to what the salary cap is, and make sure no one is going to be over the salary cap. Salary caps are pretty high compared to what we normally see, you know, investigators' salaries for phase ones, but sometimes you could have a, you know, maybe a very experienced senior personnel whose base salary is over the salary cap. In that case, you can only utilize the grant funding to pay up to the salary cap amount. If you want to pay that person more, you can, but you just can't use grant funding to do so. Okay, other personnel. So with key personnel, you're going to want to actually name names. If you don't have a name yet, you know, that's okay. It's not ideal. Ideally, you would at least have an idea of, you know, the names for all the key personnel, because they are so important to actually, you know, making that project happen. Other personnel are individuals that, you know, you can hire at time of award, so lab technicians and other individuals. So in terms of filling out the other personnel section, if you have their names, that's great. If you don't, that's fine. You can just put position titles and just describe exactly what role they're going to have in the project. Just like for your key personnel, you need to identify and justify how much time effort that person will need to devote to the project. Okay. Moving into the equipment section. For any equipment item, you definitely want to line item what that equipment is, why you need it for the project. Oftentimes, you know, if you're trying to figure out if something's a material or equipment, $5,000 is sometimes a threshold used, but different companies can use different amounts. Maybe you need a spectrophotometer that's, you know, $2,800 and you want to put that in equipment, that's fine. It can, but you know, the kind of target number is anything over 5,000 as an individual item would definitely be equipment. Now, if you need, you know, a $50,000 piece of equipment to complete your phase one, and you're only going to use it for, say, a month of the project, I would definitely consider renting or leasing rather than buying the equipment. I think that's going to be looked more favorably by reviewers. They don't want to see a huge percentage of the budget just going to a single equipment purchase for a phase one. And in fact, NSF doesn't even allow you to buy equipment with your phase one funding. Other agencies have other restrictions. Each item should be listed separately. Make sure you're justifying the need, the cost, and make sure that you include a quote for the equipment item that includes, you know, all of the bells and whistles, the shipping, maintenance costs, and associated costs. For travel, you're going to want to line item each trip that you're going to take. Describe the purpose, destination, timing, and number of individuals who will be on each trip. Make sure you're justifying the number of individuals. You don't just want to say, hey, we're taking 4 scientists to meet with the CRO. You really want to justify why each of those individuals is important to make that trip. If in doubt, you're trying to figure out, oh, I need to, you know, drop another 4 or 5K to fill up my budget. Travel is not the place I would put it because that's such a heavily scrutinized category. It's better to just kind of up the personnel levels and be as conservative as you can on the travel budget. Okay, materials and supplies. Typically what we'll see is in the budget justification is, you know, this project's going to require $28,000 total. And then your general categories, glassware, chemicals, supply costs, whatever that is, plus an amount for each category. You can do this in a table. Sometimes that looks nice. It's easier to read. Just a table of the various materials on the left, maybe quantities as another column, and then totals. Consultant services. So it's very common in SBIR STTR proposals to use consultants. This can really help you. As we mentioned in the prior module about building your team, is that it can, you know, you might need 50 people to help you commercialize your product, but there's no way you can afford to create a company with 50 full-time employees. And so consultants can play a very important role in providing that expertise that you need to commercialize your technology. However, consultants are external expenses, and there's specific rules around them you want to pay attention to as you're creating your budget. So you do want to name the consultant. I would always encourage a company to put a name down, even if you're saying, oh, well, there's 2 or 3 people in the regulatory space, I'm going to pick one. I would say choose one for your budget, and then if you decide at time of award to use someone else, that's fine, but reviewers are going to critique the expertise of that consultant, and they can't do that unless you've, you know, named a name and provided a bio sketch or CV for that individual. So you're going to identify the consultant, the expertise, the services that they will perform, the total number of days or hours, any travel costs, and then put together a total estimated cost. Keep in mind, some agencies are going to have a cap on the hourly rates, so pay attention to the details there. And again, if say the agency has a cap of 100 an hour and the consultant costs $250 an hour, you're going to have to use other money from your company to cover the difference, and you'll need to state that in your budget justification. You want to make sure, as with the other personnel, that any effort, any numbers you put in there are justified. So if the consultant is putting in 80 hours, make sure you have a very specific scope of work that would reasonably take 80 hours or so to complete. Make sure you include a letter of support from the consultant stating the work to be performed, the number of hours, and a rate per hour. In addition, the letter of the support from the consultant can really help to beef up your application if it shows, you know, enthusiasm for working with your project, maybe further validates your value proposition, and, you know, anything like that can really help as well. Also, if you have any sort of prior relationship with the consultant showing that continuation, I would include that information too. Okay. So as you're justifying your subaward or any contractual costs, make sure that you're including the total budget for all the subaward organizations, not just their direct. So make sure you're kind of grabbing that correct line, because you're going to have to pay the subawardee the total costs. Including a quotation for all subcontracts, full budgets for all subawardees, and once you do get that budget from the subawardees, I mentioned the pre-award offices are often pretty well-oiled machines, but you do want to do a reality check and make sure that everything looks good. Sometimes there's, you know, some kind of details where they provide you a form in a certain format, and you need to just change it a little bit to tweak it for that agency. So make sure that you take a look at what they've provided you, make sure that you've got the budget justification. If it's a link, that the link works from the budget information that they provide you. Again, letters of support are very helpful. I would include letters of support from everybody who's involved in the project. A vendor who's doing a small part of the project, you don't necessarily need a letter of support from them. But if you've got a subcontractor playing a major role, it's nice to include a letter. Just validating their commitment to the project and their enthusiasm. For STTRs, you do need to include a letter of intent from the partner research organization. This comes from their business office. And this can take several days to get, so you want to make sure that you start that process early. Okay, finally, your other direct costs that we haven't covered so far. Fee for service, so standard services, running analytical assays, building parts, etc. Those can go line item into other direct costs, and make sure that you include a quote for those, of course. Equipment rental. Specialized facility rental, machine shop usage, anything like that. Okay, so that covers the direct cost justification, and that's where you're really going to need to justify and line item each expense. For the indirects, you can simply include the rate requested in the base, which is usually total directs, but as I mentioned, it's a little different for some of the agencies. If the company has a negotiated rate, you can state that here. So if you are now looking at, say, your second or third phase 2 and you want to negotiate your rate, make sure that you indicate that when you create your budget so that at time of award, you can move into that rate negotiation process. And that's a little more kind of beyond the scope of this Budget 101 module, but it's something to kind of keep in mind down the road is that if you are looking at negotiating a rate, you need to make sure that that's indicated even at time of application so that you don't just get that standard rate. And then the fee, just simply include the amount requested. Some agencies, might require justification at time of award. Typically what we see is that companies utilize the fee for patent expenses because you can't actually use your indirects for patent expenses. So that's, if you are asked to justify that, that's a good use for the fee. Okay, so what are some common issues that we see? You've put together your whole research plan, you've developed your budget, it's too high. It's $500K and you're only allowed to request $300. What do you do? Well, you can reduce the scope of work. That's certainly allowable. You can, if you really need all those direct costs, you can, reduce your indirects in your fee. That's true. That's another possibility. Here I've written you can consider cost sharing, meaning that when you prepare the budget, you can write as your budget justification that the costs come out to, the total cost to do this project is $500K, but that the company is going to contribute $200K of that. If you do propose cost sharing to cover part of the total budget, make sure that you provide credibility that you have that money on hand. And so you don't want to say, oh, well, we'll figure out how to raise the extra $200K. You want to have a clear plan in mind if you are going over the budget. With the university, we can't emphasize enough, make sure you reach out early, make sure you reach out to the correct individual, which is the pre-award officer, not the PI, who's going to help you to construct that budget. Also, try to get the documents back from them 2 weeks prior to the deadline. Many universities like to give you materials the day before the deadline, and if there's any mistakes, then you won't have time to fix them. Understand the agency budget regulations up front, read all that fine print. They can, impact your scope of project. So it's important to understand that early. Know your internal versus external percentages so that you don't propose a proposal where everything's just a flow through to the company, because that's not going to be allowed. You do have to do some of the work at the company. Make sure you understand the distributions of budgets for the STTRs, the 40% company, 30% partnering research institute. Obtain your quotes early. Sometimes what you can do is request quotes from multiple vendors to make sure at least one comes back on time. We often have that happen where you're 3 weeks out from the grant, you've got to get this quote. If you are really heavily reliant on a certain quote coming in, you can sometimes ask multiple vendors to provide you with quotes so you at least get one in on time. and then make sure you've got ballpark figures really early on so that you have a sense of how the budget's going to potentially affect the scope of the proposal. Okay, so that takes us about 55 minutes in, and if you do have any questions, feel free to write them in the comments at this point.
All right, we don't have any questions at the moment. We'll give you guys a few seconds to bring those. You can type them in the Q&A section or in the chat section.
Okay, and if you're working on questions, I'll just mention that the next webinar that we have will be on August 20th. It'll actually be the final webinar, and it's the exciting one of what happens once you get funded and making the most of your money. What are your responsibilities once you receive your grant award in terms of accounting, compliance, and how do you make sure you leverage that initial grant to get additional follow-on funding through your phase 2s and other opportunities.
Okay, we do have one question that's up. You mentioned that for phase 1s, purchasing large equipment money may not be advisable. Are there other strategies that would help to make proposal more attractive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so it's tricky. I mean, so what I've done in the past is, let's say that you've got a project, and again, let's say the total budget's 500K, and your SBIR say is limited to 300K. What's going to make that SBIR proposal most attractive? And within that 500K, maybe it includes a big 100K piece of equipment. If possible, utilizing other funding for that equipment. The Kentucky Match Program is a really nice program. The problem is you can't count on it, so it's a little bit tricky because you don't want to get your phase 1 money and then not get the match, and then you're requiring that to get that piece of equipment. If you can find partnerships, if that equipment exists in a place where you can lease or rent it, that's helpful. It's just in terms of making your proposal attractive, the agencies in general like to see the money going toward people effort and materials. But if you're spending a big part of your budget on a single piece of equipment, then the budget's so tight already for a phase 1 that can really limit your ability to put in enough people hours to convince the reviewers that you have the resources to complete that project.